In the summer of 1483, behind the thick stone walls of the Tower of London, 2 boys disappeared from history. There were no screams recorded, no witnesses who came forward, no graves marked at the time. One day they were seen playing in the grounds of the tower, dressed in velvet and silk, watched by guards sworn to protect them. Then, without announcement or explanation, they were gone. Edward V, King of England in name but never crowned, was 12 years old. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, was just 9. Together they became known as the Princes in the Tower, and their disappearance remains one of the darkest unsolved mysteries in European history. England was unstable, tense, and dangerous. The Wars of the Roses had left deep scars, and power was never secure. When their father, King Edward IV, died suddenly in April 1483, the realm was thrown into uncertainty. Edward V was too young to rule alone, so authority fell to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Officially, Richard was meant to act as Lord Protector until the boy king's coronation. Unofficially, England watched carefully, knowing how often protectors became kings themselves. The Tower of London was presented as a place of safety. It was common for monarchs to stay there before coronation, a tradition meant to symbolise continuity and strength. When the princes entered the tower, it did not appear alarming. Chroniclers even noted that the boys were seen laughing and playing, visible from the outside windows. But as weeks passed, sightings became fewer. By late summer, they were no longer seen at all. Questions began to circulate quietly, then urgently. Where were the princes? Why had preparations for Edward's coronation abruptly stopped? Soon after, Richard made a stunning announcement. Edward V and his brother were declared illegitimate, supposedly the result of a secret prior marriage by their father. With that declaration, Richard claimed the throne and was crowned King Richard III. The princes, now officially stripped of their rights, remained in the tower, and then history fell silent. No public execution was announced, no burial was recorded, no official explanation was offered. In an age where even political murders were often loudly justified, this silence was unusual. Rumours filled the void. Some claimed the boys were smothered in their sleep. Others whispered they had been poisoned or starved. But these accounts emerged years later, often written under the Tudor dynasty that defeated Richard III and had every reason to portray him as a monster. The truth became tangled in propaganda, fear, and the passage of time. For centuries, the mystery relied on words alone: chronicles, accusations, and Shakespeare's dramatic villainy. But words are shaped by loyalty and power. Today, something else stands ready to speak: forensic science. Bones do not care who wore the crown. DNA does not recognize dynasties. Modern technology offers the possibility of separating fact from fiction, evidence from legend. In 1674, when workmen uncovered a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons beneath a staircase in the tower, many believed the mystery had finally found its answer. The remains were solemnly placed in Westminster Abbey, labelled as the Princes. Yet belief is not proof. The skeletons were never conclusively identified. A limited examination in 1933 suggested the bones belonged to 2 children of similar age, but the tools of the time could not confirm identity, cause of death, or even whether the remains were related. Today, the case stands frozen between past and present. The bones remain sealed. Permission for modern testing has never been granted, and so the tower still holds its secret. This is not just a medieval tragedy, it is a cold case, unfinished, unresolved, and waiting. As science advances and historical loyalties fade, the question becomes impossible to ignore. If we can finally know the truth, why haven't we tried? The princes in the tower vanished into silence. But silence, when examined closely, can speak louder than any accusation. And this story begins where the voices stopped. To understand how 2 royal children could vanish from the heart of London without justice, one must first grasp the bloody legacy that made it possible. England in the 15th century was a realm splintered by betrayal, fractured loyalties, and dynastic rage. A kingdom where kings fell faster than seasons changed, and where the throne was never secure. This was the War of the Roses, a brutal, decades-long civil war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, two branches of the same royal bloodline that tore England apart. The conflict began not with violence, but with a question of legitimacy. Who had the stronger claim to the crown? The Lancasters, represented by the Red Rose, had held the throne for generations, but their rule was marred by weak kingship, most notably Henry VI, a monarch plagued by mental illness and periods of catatonia. During his reign, noble factions gathered like storm clouds. Chief among them was the House of York, bearing the White Rose and led by Richard, Duke of York, father to the future Edward IV. What started as a battle of claims soon turned into a cycle of assassinations, betrayals, and open warfare. From the 1450s onward, England became a chessboard of shifting alliances. Battles such as Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury soaked English soil with noble blood. The landscape of the nobility was reshaped with every conflict. Families extinguished, heirs executed, titles stripped. It was in this chaos that Edward IV rose to power, deposing the fragile Henry VI and claiming the crown for the House of York. Edward IV was a charismatic and capable ruler, but his reign was not free of scandal. His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville enraged his court and alienated powerful allies. His reliance on her family, the Woodvilles, deepened tensions among the nobility. Even Edward's brother, Richard of Gloucester, who would later become Richard III, grew resentful. The seeds of betrayal were being planted within the very house that had won the war. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 reopened old wounds. Though peace had returned to the land, it was built on the fragile bones of the fallen. With his 12-year-old son declared king, the old paranoia returned. The Lancastrian threat, though diminished, still lingered. Powerful men began to maneuver, some out of ambition, others out of fear. And amidst it all, the question echoed again: who should rule? In this volatile environment, no one was safe, especially not child kings. A minor on the throne meant opportunity for those lurking in the shadows. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had loyally served his brother in war, now saw a kingdom once more at the brink of division. Was it his duty to protect the realm, or a chance to seize power? He moved swiftly, arresting Edward of E's guardians, taking custody of the prince and then the younger brother. The Tower of London, once a fortress against enemies, became a vault for family secrets. But it was not the stone that condemned the princes. It was the legacy of the war, the ruthless logic of survival, the blood-soaked path to power, the belief that a crown could only rest safely atop a corpse. By the time Richard III was crowned, England had endured over 30 years of civil war. The people were tired, hungry for peace, and perhaps willing to turn a blind eye if it meant stability. But beneath that silence, the ghosts of the War of the Roses still whispered. The princes were not the first to be sacrificed on the altar of power. They were simply the youngest. Their disappearance was not an isolated crime. It was the final act of a long and violent tragedy, where survival often meant silencing any voice that could challenge the crown. In a kingdom shaped by betrayal, their fate was not just possible, it was inevitable. Before they were ghosts, before they became the silent question mark in English history, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were simply two boys. Born into power and expectation, they were sons of a king, heirs to a throne, and symbols of a dynasty that had fought its way out of civil war. But even as infants, their fates were already being shaped by ambition, alliances, and a nation that had no patience for innocence. Edward, the elder of the two, was born on November 2nd, 1470, during a period of intense upheaval. His father, Edward IV of the House of York, had temporarily lost the throne and was living in exile. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and gave birth surrounded by fear and uncertainty. It was a chaotic beginning for a child destined to be king, but fortune reversed quickly. Edward IV reclaimed the crown within months and his son's status soared. Young Edward became Prince of Wales, groomed for kingship with the weight of a fragile peace resting on his shoulders. By all accounts, Edward was intelligent, composed, and remarkably serious for his age. He was educated in the classics, trained in the arts of diplomacy and leadership. Even his enemies noted his poise. He was not a carefree child, he was royalty born in the shadow of war, taught to wear the crown long before it rested on his head. He spent much of his early life in Ludlow, presiding over the Council of the Welsh Marches, where he was treated not as a boy, but as a future monarch already in training. His younger brother Richard was born just 2 years later, on August 17, 1473. He was given the title Duke of York and was known to be livelier, perhaps more spirited. He followed his brother wherever he went, their bond evident even in the sparse records that survive. Together, they were the hope of the Yorkist line, a symbol that the dynasty might finally bring England peace through family, succession and order. But to others, their very existence was a threat. The bloodlines of the English throne were treacherously entangled. With the boys alive and legitimate, any claim to the crown made by another, even their Uncle Richard or later Henry Tudor, was weakened. And so, their presence in the Tower after their father's death was not incidental. It was pivotal. Edward, already crowned in name, was to be officially installed as king, but days after arriving in London, his uncle arrested his protectors and advisors, claiming plots against the realm. Soon, both boys were placed under Richard's protection inside the Tower of London. What followed was not a ceremony, but a disappearance. These were not faceless heirs, these were children, very real and very visible, who had walked through crowds, attended courts and received noble visitors. Their sudden absence was glaring. The last recorded sighting of Edward V was in June of 1483, standing at a window, gazing out over the gardens. After that, nothing. No messages, no royal declarations, just silence. Why did they disappear? Because their names represented a different future, because in their veins flowed the legitimacy that others envied or feared, because in the ruthless logic of medieval politics, a child could be more dangerous than an army. To humanize the princes is not to romanticize them. It is to remember that history often devours its young, not out of hatred, but out of calculation. Their story is not simply a royal mystery. It is a reminder that even in the highest towers, with titles and silken prayers, children can vanish when power feels threatened. Centuries later, we study their portraits, read their letters, and listen for their voices in the stone halls of the tower. But we should never forget. They were not merely symbols, they were boys, and they deserved better. Before they were ghosts, before they became the silent question mark in English history, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were simply two boys. On the morning of April 9th, 1483, King Edward IV, once the towering, battle-forged figure of Yorkist triumph, was dead. He was only 40 years old. His reign had brought a rare moment of stability after decades of brutal civil war. His charisma, military prowess, and strategic mind had won him both allies and the English crown. But death, when it came, did not wait for the kingdom to be ready. It arrived quietly and swiftly, leaving the throne in the hands of a child, and the realm vulnerable to ambitions buried just beneath the surface. The exact cause of Edward IV's death remains unclear even today. Some sources suggest pneumonia or a common illness worsened by excesses. He was known for a lavish lifestyle and his health had begun to deteriorate. Others whisper of poisoning, though there's no direct evidence. What is certain is that his death came without sufficient preparation. No stable regency council had been fully established. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 and residing at Ludlow Castle. His widow, Elizabeth Woodville, was immediately thrust into a whirlwind of fear and suspicion, and his brother, Richard of Gloucester, far in the north, began moving with uncanny speed toward London. Edward IV had been many things: warrior, politician, womanizer, and king. But perhaps his greatest failing was that he believed he had time to unify his court, time to prepare his son, time to tie the many threads of England's fragile peace into something lasting. But time ran out, and in the vacuum his death created, old grudges resurfaced with vengeance. The Woodvilles, Elizabeth's powerful and ambitious family, had grown rich and influential under Edward's protection. Their rapid rise through the ranks of nobility had made them numerous enemies. Now, with the king gone, they were isolated. Their most important ally lay in state at Westminster, and his son, the new king, was still a boy, surrounded by Woodville loyalists, but far from the capital and far from safety. Richard of Gloucester moved quickly. He intercepted young Edward at Stony Stratford, a seemingly routine meeting that turned into a coup in miniature. Richard arrested the boy's maternal uncle and half-brother, key members of the Woodville faction, and took custody of the new king. He justified his actions with smooth political language: protection, guardianship, defense of the realm. But beneath the surface, it was a seizure of power. Edward IV's death had not only unseated a man, it had disrupted a precarious balance. With the king gone, the checks and alliances that once kept rivals in line began to collapse. Each noble family began to reassess its place. Each saw opportunity or threat. Richard, a seasoned commander, knew this well. He'd fought beside his brother in the bloodiest battles of the War of the Roses. He had seen what happened when kings failed to act quickly, and now he acted. By mid-May, young Edward V was in the Tower of London, awaiting his coronation. But the ceremony never came. Instead, Richard began to raise suspicions about his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. Suddenly, questions were being asked in Parliament. Was Edward IV's marriage legal? Were his children truly legitimate? The campaign to disinherit the princes had begun, quietly at first, then with undeniable speed. The death of Edward IV was not merely the passing of a king, it was the trigger that unleashed years of suppressed ambition and buried fear. It left England exposed, the royal heirs in peril, and the throne vulnerable to anyone ruthless enough to take it. And in that storm of uncertainty, two boys, born into royalty, became pawns on a board reset for treachery. For all his might in life, Edward IV could not protect his sons in death. He could not predict the ambitions of his own blood, and he could not stop the tower's gates from closing behind his children. His death was not the end of a dynasty, but the moment it began to crumble. When Edward IV died in 1483, few would have suspected that his loyal brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would soon become king. Fewer still would have believed how swiftly, how quietly, and how bloodlessly he would dismantle the very succession his brother had built. Richard had long stood in the shadow of his older sibling, a skilled commander on the battlefield and a man known for loyalty and discipline. But beneath that image there lay a calculating strategist, and in the weeks following Edward's death, that side of Richard would emerge, cloaked in the rhetoric of duty and protection. As Lord Protector, Richard's initial steps seemed justified. A 12-year-old king, Edward V, could not rule alone. It was customary for a close male relative to act as regent, and Richard, already seasoned by war and governance in the north, had earned respect. His appointment was expected. What was not expected, however, was how quickly Richard would sideline, arrest, and eliminate those closest to the young king. At Stony Stratford, Richard met young Edward V en route to London. With a cordial smile, he arrested Edward's uncle, Earl Rivers, and his half-brother, Lord Richard Grey. Both were key members of the Woodville faction, the Queen's family. It was presented as a precaution, a necessary act to secure the king's person. Richard assured the court he meant only to protect his nephew from manipulation. But as the arrests mounted, the Crown's advisors noticed a shift. Power was being consolidated, and the boy king was being isolated. When Richard escorted Edward V into London and lodged him in the Tower, in preparation for his coronation, few raised alarm. The Tower was a royal residence as much as a fortress. The coronation was scheduled for June 22nd, yet, as the date approached, it was quietly postponed. The Queen had fled to sanctuary at Westminster with her younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury. She feared for her family, and perhaps she understood what Richard's growing presence in court truly meant. The turning point came with a sermon delivered by Dr. Ralph Shah at St. Paul's Cross. In front of a bewildered crowd, Shah declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, having been contracted while Edward was already betrothed to another. This stunning announcement rendered all of Edward IV's children, royal or not, illegitimate in the eyes of the law. The declaration shocked London. Within days, Parliament convened and the children of Edward IV were legally disinherited. Richard, now the only legitimate adult male heir of the House of York, was declared the rightful king. On July 6th of 1483, Richard III was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The boy who should have worn the crown sat behind the walls of the Tower, watching history reshape itself. From Lord Protector To monarch in less than 3 months, Richard had pulled off what some called a political masterstroke, others a royal coup. Even today, historians remain divided. Was Richard acting to protect the realm from civil war and Woodville influence, as he claimed? Or was this the long-planned ambition of a man who'd bided his time through years of loyal service? The chronicles of the time offer contradictory portraits. Some show Richard as a necessary guardian of peace, others as a cold usurper who moved methodically toward absolute power. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Richard ruled England for only 2 years, but his rise to power, swift, strategic, and bloodless on the surface, was built on quiet eliminations, legal maneuvers, and a masterful control of perception. In that world, even a child king's title could be undone with a sermon. Even blood ties could be erased with a stroke of ink. And still, the princes remained inside the tower. Their titles stripped, their protectors gone, their voices unheard. The crown had changed heads, but what would become of the boys who once wore it by right? As Richard III took his place on the throne, England waited, and the silence from the tower deepened. The great fortress of the Tower of London was meant to protect kings. Its thick stone walls had withstood foreign sieges and domestic rebellions. Its moat had reflected the faces of monarchs on the eve of coronation. But in the summer of 1483, it became something else, an elegant cage for 2 boys whose bloodline made them dangerous. Edward V, the 12-year-old king in name, and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, just 9, entered the tower in mid-May. At first, there was no reason to fear. The tower was the traditional lodging for monarchs before their coronation, and Edward's was scheduled for June 22nd. He arrived escorted by his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, now Lord Protector, and was met with pageantry and deference. London welcomed its young king, even as the city held its breath in the absence of Edward's mother and her supporters. Soon after, his younger brother was summoned. Despite his mother, Elizabeth Woodville's desperate attempts to keep Richard hidden in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, church authorities bowed to pressure. They were told the younger boy must join his brother. For companionship, they said. To refuse would be to defy both royal custom and the Lord Protector's will. And so, reluctantly, the Queen surrendered her second son. The brothers were reunited behind stone and iron. In the beginning they were seen. Courtiers, servants, and even foreign visitors recorded glimpses of the boys playing in the tower gardens, leaning from windows, dressed in rich garments, sometimes reading or talking together. There were no immediate signs of distress, but then the coronation was postponed, then postponed again, and soon whispers replaced pageantry. The boys were no longer seen in the gardens. The windows, once animated with laughter, became still. The final confirmed sighting came in late June. A royal physician allegedly visited the tower and saw both boys in good health. After that, they vanished, not in the dramatic fashion of murder or rebellion, but in slow and chilling silence. The guards changed, the staff rotated, letters stopped, and no public declarations explained their absence. The city took notice. Rumours began to spread. Had they been moved? Were they ill? Had they died? Richard III, now crowned king, issued no statement. Parliament offered no answers. Foreign envoys wrote nervously to their courts, describing a capital caught between awe and anxiety. Contemporary chroniclers offer scattered theories. Some say the boys were smothered in their sleep with pillows. Others claim they were starved, poisoned, or buried beneath the stairs. But no bodies were ever officially produced. No trial, no confession, no grave, only time and silence. What makes this disappearance so haunting is not just its cruelty, it is its precision. The boys were removed from view without uproar, without evidence, and with such effectiveness that not even a definitive corpse could speak for them. It was, in effect, the perfect political erasure. A quiet rewriting of the future through absence. And yet, for all the secrecy, the tower itself holds memory. The princes may have faded from the world of the living, but their absence remains its loudest presence. Even centuries later, visitors to the tower pause at its windows and narrow corridors, imagining small footsteps echoing in empty halls. Historians debate whether Richard III gave the order or if others acted independently, Buckingham perhaps, or agents loyal to a greater cause. But motive clings like mist. The princes were threats. Their claim to the throne was stronger. Their presence invited rebellion. And in a kingdom weary of war, the quickest path to peace was often paved in blood. In their last days, Edward and Richard may not have understood the politics that doomed them. They may have hoped still for their coronation or for release. But what they could not have known was that the door which closed behind them in the tower would never open again, not for them. Their final days were passed in luxury, yes, but also in confinement. Two boys waiting for a ceremony that never came, their lives slowly erased by a silence that would become legend. The tower grew silent, and so did England. As the summer of 1483 gave way to autumn, the laughter and light once seen in the royal apartments vanished with the two boys. But absence breeds rumour, and silence rarely holds for long. Whispers filled the void, quiet at first, then louder, more insistent, until they reached the ears of foreign courts, enemy factions, and writers who would forever shape the myth of the princes in the tower. Yet, how much of what we know is truth, and how much is crafted story, designed not to inform but to control? The earliest known claim that the princes were murdered came not from an English noble or a grieving relative, but from abroad. In December of 1483, only 6 months after Richard III's coronation, the Grand Prior of the Order of St. John in England relayed to the French court that the princes were dead, possibly put to death. The source? Unclear. The certainty? Thin. But the idea took root. That winter, rumours spread across France, Brittany and Burgundy. The princes, once so visible, were now spectres. Foreign diplomats wrote home with cautious phrasing. The Milanese ambassador recorded that Edward V had been done away with. Yet none of these reports offered names, methods or bodies. The absence of hard evidence did not slow the tide of speculation. Instead, it fueled it. The disappearance itself became the evidence. Then, more than 30 years after the boys vanished, a new voice stepped forward. Sir Thomas More, a lawyer, scholar, and eventually Lord Chancellor under Henry VIII, More was still a child in 1483. He had no first-hand knowledge of the prince's fate, but in the early 1500s he penned what would become the most detailed and lasting narrative of their murder. According to More, Richard III ordered Sir James Tyrrell, a loyal retainer, to smother the boys with pillows as they slept. Two men, Tyrrell's underlings, carried out the grim deed, buried the bodies beneath a staircase in the tower, and later moved them to a more secret place. More's account is vivid, dramatic, and highly specific, but it is also deeply suspect. He wrote under the Tudor dynasty, the very regime that overthrew Richard III at Bosworth, and had every incentive to paint him as a tyrant. More never cited sources. He wrote his account decades after the fact, likely using second-hand gossip, official Tudor narratives, and his own sharp imagination to fill in the gaps. Yet his version stuck. When Shakespeare, writing a century later, dramatised Richard III as a hunchbacked villain with blood on his hands, he leaned heavily on More's tale. The image of Richard III as a child killer became immortal. But was it fair? Historians still debate this fiercely. Some defend More, arguing that he had access to circles close to the tower and may have heard credible accounts. Others see his work as Tudor propaganda, designed to legitimise Henry VII's reign by demonising the usurper he defeated. Then there are accounts even less reliable, like that of the Croyland Chronicle, which hints vaguely at sorrow surrounding the tower. And there are rumours passed in hushed tones through monastic records, some of which claimed that one of the boys, likely Richard, may have escaped. All these voices speak from shadowed corners. None provide the clarity we seek. And perhaps that is why the mystery persists. The story we have is not a clean record of evidence, but a tapestry of suggestion, threads woven from fear, ambition, and the agenda of kings. It's also crucial to remember Richard III was killed in 1485, only 2 years after the princes vanished. His body was left naked and mutilated on the battlefield, his crown taken by Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. With Richard's death, the incentive to erase the princes vanished, because they had already served their purpose. Whether they were dead or alive, their usefulness was spent. And history, always written by the victors, had no trouble telling the version that best suited the new regime. So, what do we believe? The words of diplomats, the sharp pen of Thomas More, the poetic justice of Shakespeare, or the grim possibility that we may never know and that all we have are whispers? If history teaches us anything, it's that disappearance in a royal court is never without purpose. The fate of Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury was not an accident. It was a decision. To vanish so thoroughly, so permanently from the heart of England's most guarded fortress could not have happened without the knowledge or the will of powerful individuals. But who had the most to gain from their erasure? Who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to silence two boys whose only crime was royal blood? The first and most obvious suspect is Richard III. As their uncle and Lord Protector, he had custody of the boys and full control over the Tower of London. He had already declared them illegitimate, secured the crown for himself, and suppressed Woodville influence. Many argue that their continued existence, even as bastards, was too great a risk. They could become figureheads for rebellion. As long as they lived, the realm might divide again. Eliminating them would solve the problem, cleanly, quietly. Richard's motives align with political necessity. He was not a man of public cruelty. He preferred legality and order, but his actions during the summer of 1483 grew increasingly desperate. He'd executed William Hastings, arrested the boys' guardians, and surrounded himself with northern loyalists. He was tightening control over a capital growing uneasy with the prince's absence. If he gave the order, it may have been less an act of malice and more of calculation, a preemptive strike to preserve a crown taken in haste. But Richard was not the only man with power, and not the only one with ambition. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was once Richard's closest ally during the coup that brought down the Woodvilles, but his loyalty shifted suspiciously fast. Within months of Richard's coronation, Buckingham turned against him, leading a rebellion in support of Henry Tudor. Why the sudden betrayal? Some historians believe Buckingham sought the throne for himself, tracing his bloodline to Edward III. Others think he grew disillusioned by Richard's reign. But one theory remains chillingly plausible, that Buckingham acted independently and had the princes murdered, either to impress Richard or to clear his own path to power. As Constable of the Tower, Buckingham had access. He commanded men loyal to him within its walls. If the boys disappeared under his watch, Richard may not have known until it was too late. But if that were true, why did Richard not condemn him? Why did he not publicly mourn the princes or seek justice? Silence again becomes damning. Then we come to Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, the exiled Lancastrian claimant across the Channel. At the time of the prince's disappearance, Henry was plotting his return, but with Edward V alive, his claim was weak. The boys had a better bloodline, their presence undermined his legitimacy. When he landed in England in 1485 and defeated Richard at Bosworth, one of his first acts as king was to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, and unite the feuding houses. But conspicuously, he never investigated the prince's fate. No inquiry, no exhumation, no public statement. Had he known what happened to them? Or worse, had his mother? Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, is often painted as pious, calculating, and fiercely devoted to her son's future. She had influence at court, especially with Buckingham. Some theorize she orchestrated the boys' deaths to secure the path for Henry. It's circumstantial, but Margaret was no stranger to political gamesmanship. Her subtle manoeuvring helped bring Henry to power. Could she have moved more directly? Each suspect fits a different narrative. Richard III, the usurper protecting his stolen crown. Buckingham, the ambitious opportunist. Henry VII, the silent beneficiary. Margaret Beaufort, the shadowy matriarch. But the common thread binding them is motive. The boys were in the way, and so we are left with suspects but no verdict, with political ghosts whose deeds may never be proven. The Tower may have swallowed the princes, but the question of who turned the key remains as sharp today as it was in 1483. For nearly 2 centuries, the fate of the princes in the Tower remained buried beneath silence, suspicion, and centuries of shifting royal dynasties. Then, in 1674, something surfaced, something bone-deep and haunting. It was not a confession nor a lost manuscript, but a physical discovery. During routine renovations at the Tower of London, beneath the crumbling staircase in the White Tower, workmen uncovered a small wooden box. Inside were human remains, 2 small skeletons laid together, unmoving in death, and yet screaming with implication. Could these be the missing princes? The discovery, according to the records of the day, was almost accidental. The staircase, part of an old demolition project under the reign of King Charles II, was being cleared to make way for a new guardhouse. As stones were pulled away, the workers found the box wedged beneath rubble, sealed, unmarked and untouched. When opened, it revealed a grim relic, the remains of 2 children, no clothes, no jewellery, no casket fit for royalty, just bones, brittle with age and proximity, curled like secrets waiting to be told. The news ignited immediate interest. Charles II, reigning nearly 200 years after the boys vanished, ordered the bones to be transferred to Westminster Abbey. There they were interred in an urn beneath a white marble slab in the Henry VII Chapel. The inscription declared them to be the bones of Edward V and his brother Richard, but the words engraved in stone were built on little more than assumption. There was no forensic analysis in 1674, no attempt to age the bones, no test of kinship or lineage. The judgment was historical, not scientific, based solely on location, context, and the long-standing suspicion that the princes had been buried somewhere within the tower. In a sense, the mystery had found its grave, but not its answer. It was a convenient resolution for a monarchy that had every reason to close the book. The Stuart dynasty, like the Tudors before them, had inherited power through a chain of conflict and propaganda. The legitimacy of Henry VII's rule, founder of the Tudor line, rested on the belief that Richard III had murdered the rightful heirs. To suggest otherwise in the 17th century would have undermined the narrative used to justify a century of Tudor policy. Declaring the bones those of the princes affirmed history. It gave closure, even if it didn't offer proof. Yet even in burial, questions lingered. The box had no inscription. The bones were found alongside animal remains. Was this truly a secret royal grave, or simply the resting place of unknown children lost in time? The tower had been a fortress, a prison, a barracks. Deaths, accidental or violent, were not uncommon within its walls. Could these have been the remains of others? It wasn't until 1933 that the bones were briefly exhumed for study. A team of anatomists examined them, but with the limited tools of the time. Their conclusions were tentative. The bones likely belonged to 2 children around the right age. But they could not determine the cause of death, nor could they confirm identity. Worse still, some of the bones were missing. Others had been handled without proper care, compromising their value as evidence. Since then, calls for modern DNA testing have been persistent but consistently denied. The Church of England, custodians of the remains, has refused requests to disturb them again. Palace officials have remained silent. Forensic scientists today could easily confirm whether the bones belong to the royal line of Edward IV using mitochondrial DNA from known descendants. But the door to the urn in Westminster remains closed, sealed not just in marble, but in politics, tradition, and discomfort. So we are left with a mystery hidden inside another. 2 skeletons, no names, no voice, no conclusive proof, just a wooden box beneath a staircase and a kingdom eager for resolution. Were they the lost princes, at last returned from silence? Or were they another set of innocents wrapped in the wrong story, misidentified to suit a monarch's narrative? In history, even bones can lie, or more precisely, they can be made to speak only the words others place in their mouths. Centuries after their silent disappearance, and decades after their supposed remains were laid to rest beneath marble in Westminster Abbey, the princes were once again brought into the light, this time not as royals, but as subjects of science. In 1933, under the reign of King George V, the Church of England authorised a long-requested exhumation of the bones discovered in the tower in 1674. For the first time, modern tools, though primitive by today's standards, would attempt to answer the question history had failed to settle: Were these the lost sons of Edward IV? The urn was opened with great ceremony and secrecy. Tucked beneath its engraved lid were the partial remains of 2 children, bones brittle with age and interrupted decay. But even from the start, the examination faced limitations. Many of the bones were missing, either lost, damaged, or perhaps never recovered from the original tower staircase excavation. What remained were fragments, skulls, rare ribs, turn, and long bones, insufficient for a full reconstruction but enough for speculation. The analysis was led by Lawrence Tanner, archivist at Westminster Abbey, and Professor William Wright, an anatomist. Their task was formidable: estimate the age of the children at death, determine sex, and search for any evidence of trauma or disease. But early 20th century forensics had its limits. There was no radiocarbon dating, no DNA analysis, no isotope testing. The tools of the time were measuring tapes, visual inspection, and best-guess comparisons with known child development data. Their conclusions, published with cautious phrasing, suggested the bones likely belonged to 2 children aged approximately 10 and 13, close to the ages of Edward and Richard at the time of their disappearance. The skeletons were said to show signs of being male, though the pelvic bones, which provide the clearest sex indicators, were too degraded to confirm this definitively. But the problems ran deeper than the bones themselves. The scientific methods of 1933 were shaped by Victorian assumptions and social biases. At the time, craniometry, the measuring of skull shape and size, was still used to draw conclusions about identity and lineage, a practice now widely discredited. The examiners had no control group, no genetic comparisons, and no context beyond the legend that had already named the bones before a single scalpel had been drawn. Moreover, the analysis was conducted within the cloistered confines of royal and ecclesiastical authority. The monarchy, wary of controversy, allowed the study, but insisted on reverence and discretion. The church demanded that the remains be returned to their urn, regardless of the outcome. The possibility of opening the investigation wider, examining other bones, testing royal descendants for comparison, was never pursued. And so, in the end, the findings were inconclusive. The bones were likely from 2 boys of the right age, but were they the princes? The data could not say. There were no signs of blunt trauma, but then there were also no signs of any cause of death at all. The conclusions fell somewhere between informed guesswork and hopeful narrative. The princes remained missing, not in body but in certainty. The urn was sealed once more, placed back beneath the marble floor, its questions unanswered. The scientific lens had flickered briefly on their story, only to go dim again. But in that brief moment, it opened a door, one that modern forensic science could now walk through with clarity, precision, and truth. And yet, the Church has never permitted further testing. Requests by scientists and historians have been denied on grounds of sanctity and respect for the dead. Even as DNA breakthroughs redefine ancestry and unlock centuries-old mysteries, the bones lie untouched, guarded not by stone or steel but by tradition. In 1933, we tried to listen to what the bones could tell us, but our ears were not ready. Today, we may finally have the tools, but the silence remains, this time not because we cannot hear, but because we are not allowed to ask. In an age where DNA can identify a person centuries after death, where science has restored names to the anonymous and solved murders older than empires, the mystery of the princes in the tower endures, not because it cannot be solved, but because we are not allowed to try. The bones unearthed in 1674, buried in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, and once believed to be Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, remain untouched. They rest in hallowed ground, untested, unconfirmed, protected not just by stone, but by silence. Why? The technology exists. Since the 1990s, mitochondrial DNA has transformed historical investigation. It was used to confirm the identity of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. It verified the remains of King Richard III beneath a parking lot in Leicester. With similar methods, forensic scientists today could extract a genetic profile from the bones in the abbey and compare it to known living descendants of Edward IV's family, or even Richard III, whose remains were conclusively tested in 2012. In theory, within weeks, we could confirm if the bones truly belonged to the lost princes. And yet, every formal request to reopen the urn has been denied. Appeals from historians, scientists, and even members of Parliament have been met with refusal. The reasons given: respect for the dead, religious sanctity, the desire not to disturb a royal burial without overwhelming cause. These justifications sound noble, but beneath them lie questions too uncomfortable to ignore. Is this really about protecting two boys who died over 500 years ago? Or is it about protecting the story we've told ourselves ever since? For the British monarchy, the tale of the princes has always been politically loaded. Richard III, long cast as their murderer, was the final Yorkist king. His defeat by Henry Tudor at Bosworth launched the Tudor dynasty, a line that includes Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and laid the foundation for modern Britain. The Tudors cemented their legitimacy by painting Richard as a child killer. If DNA testing were to reveal that the bones are not the princes, or that they died by other hands, or even that they lived, it could unravel a cornerstone of that historic narrative. It's not just Richard III whose reputation hangs in the balance. The legitimacy of the Tudor claim to the throne could be re-examined. If the boys were not murdered or were killed by someone else, say by agents of Henry VII after he took power, the implications would be seismic. History would need rewriting. And perhaps that is the real danger, not to the monarchy as it stands today, but to the mythos upon which it was built. There are also fears of precedent. If these royal bones are disturbed for DNA testing, where does it stop? Do we test all royal remains with disputed histories? Do we open sealed tombs across the land, in churches and cathedrals, to satisfy curiosity or scholarship? Some argue that the sacred must be protected from the scalpel of science. But what is more sacred, truth or tradition? Public opinion is shifting. In a world where forensic genealogy reunites families and solves mysteries every day, the refusal to test these bones appears increasingly archaic. Scientists assure us the process would be non-destructive. A few grams of material, bone or tooth, would be enough. The analysis could be done with respect, without disturbing the burial site beyond necessity. And yet, the gates remain closed. Perhaps the real reason the bones are not tested is because someone, somewhere, already suspects what they'll reveal, that they are not the princes, or that they are, and that they died at the hands of someone other than Richard III, or that the truth is stranger still, a substitution, a survival, an escape. But until the urn is opened again, the truth is held hostage to fear, politics, and an outdated reverence that prioritizes myth over memory. History doesn't rot, it waits. It waits in boxes beneath floorboards. It waits in royal chapels. It waits in silence until someone dares to listen. If the bones interred beneath Westminster Abbey were made available to modern science, the centuries-old silence surrounding the princes in the tower could finally be broken, not with guesswork or dramatized history, but with data. Cold, clear, unassailable data. Today's forensic tools are no longer limited by the primitive instruments of 1933. We now possess a suite of methods that could uncover the truth about the remains, who they were, where they came from, how they lived, and how they died. First, DNA analysis. With advances in mitochondrial DNA sequencing, scientists could extract genetic material from teeth or dense bones, like the petrous part of the temporal bone, known for preserving DNA remarkably well, even in centuries-old remains. This genetic fingerprint could then be compared to known living descendants of Edward IV and his siblings, many of whom have been traced through well-documented noble lines. This is exactly how Richard III was identified in 2012, using a match to a living descendant of his sister, Anne of York. If the bones in the urn match Edward IV's line, we would have near irrefutable proof they are the princes. Second, radiocarbon dating. Although this method has its limitations, particularly for remains from the late 15th century, Refined calibration curves and Bayesian modelling could offer a narrowed date range of death. If the skeletons date to around 1483, consistent with the prince's disappearance, it would strongly support their identity. If they don't, it could mean we've misattributed the remains entirely. Third, isotope analysis. By examining the levels of certain elements like strontium and oxygen in the teeth and bones, scientists can determine where an individual grew up and what they ate. The princes were raised in royal households, likely consuming a diet rich in meat, fish, and imported goods. This kind of elite upbringing leaves a signature in the bones. If the isotope profile doesn't match what would be expected of highborn boys in late medieval England, it would cast serious doubt on the assumption that these were Edward and Richard. Fourth, paleopathology and skeletal trauma assessment. Modern forensic anthropology could determine whether the children suffered malnutrition, illness, or physical injury. Did they show signs of violence? Smothering may not leave traces, but blows, fractures, or stabbings might. Even the position of the bodies in the burial context, if it can be reconstructed, could provide clues. Were they dumped hastily or buried with care? All of these methods could be applied without desecrating the burial. A few grams of material extracted through micro-invasive techniques would suffice. In short, science is ready. The technology exists. The will exists. What's missing is the permission. Experts in the field have spoken with increasing clarity. Dr. Turi King, the geneticist who identified Richard III, has said that the prince's case is one of the most compelling unresolved forensic mysteries in British history, and that the techniques used on Richard could easily be replicated here. Dr. John Ashdown Hill, now deceased but a key member of the Richard III team, also advocated for the testing, emphasising that modern tools could resolve the matter decisively for the benefit of history and truth. So why hasn't it happened? The official reason remains the same: respect for the dead. But science can be respectful. In fact, the entire ethos of forensic archaeology is rooted in care, treating the dead not just as specimens, but as people with stories that deserve to be told accurately. Leaving the bones untested does not preserve dignity, it preserves uncertainty. And uncertainty has always been the playground of propaganda. Imagine, just for a moment, what we might discover. The confirmation that these were indeed the princes would give them names, justice, and closure denied for over 5 centuries. Or the revelation that they were not, opening an entirely new line of inquiry. What if the real princes were buried elsewhere? What if they escaped? What if someone else was buried in their place? We are standing on the edge of revelation, looking into a grave that holds either the truth or another red herring, and all that holds us back is tradition, inertia, and a fear, perhaps not of the truth itself, but of the consequences it may bring. The tower gave us silence. Science can give us answers. The question is, will we ever be brave enough to ask them? For over 5 centuries, the accepted story has been one of quiet murder. 2 royal boys taken into the tower and never seen again, presumed dead by the hands of power. But what if that story is wrong? What if silence did not mean death, but concealment? Across generations, a different set of theories has lingered at the edges of historical orthodoxy. Whispers of escape, hints of substitution, claims of survival. These ideas are often dismissed as fantasy, but some details refuse to die. Among the most enduring alternative theories is that one or both of the princes escaped. The idea suggests that, rather than being murdered in the tower, the boys were smuggled out, perhaps with the help of loyalists still sympathetic to their father, Edward IV, or even by Richard III himself, who may have wished to remove them from danger without drawing attention. Proponents of this theory point to the vagueness of the disappearance. No bodies were ever presented, no death publicly announced, no executioners ever named. In a medieval world of rumour and counter-rumour, the absence of evidence becomes a kind of evidence in itself. The escape theory also gains traction from the idea that the boys could have been switched. Some suggest that the children seen at the tower may not have been the princes at all, but body doubles, decoys. The real boys, spirited away in the chaos, hidden among distant relatives or taken abroad. With the right wigs, garments and handlers, substitution was not impossible in a court where appearances were everything and Few commoners had ever seen a royal child up close. But perhaps the most tantalising possibility of all came years later in the form of a man who called himself Perkin Warbeck. In 1491, nearly a decade after the presumed deaths of the princes, a young man appeared in Burgundy claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two lost boys. His story was astonishing. According to Warbeck, he had escaped from the tower with the help of sympathetic guards, was raised in secret, and had only now come forward to reclaim his birthright. His claim electrified Europe. The Duchess of Burgundy, sister to Edward IV, supported him. So did the King of Scotland, and for a brief moment the old Yorkist cause flared back to life. Warbeck was intelligent, charismatic, and bore a striking resemblance to the York line. He spoke fluent French, adopted courtly manners, and held himself with regal bearing. English supporters began to rally. Was it all an elaborate fraud, or had one of the princes truly returned? Henry VII, now firmly on the throne, took the threat seriously. He launched a relentless propaganda campaign to discredit Warbeck. After multiple failed invasions and capture, Warbeck was paraded through London as a pretender, imprisoned, and eventually executed in 1499. But before his death, he never fully recanted. Some historians believe his confession was coerced. Others think he was merely a puppet, an impostor used by foreign courts to destabilize Tudor England. But Warbeck's case left a question behind that still lingers. How did a common man manage to impersonate a royal so convincingly, and why did so many believe him? The lack of clear evidence about the real Richard's fate made belief possible. The vacuum of certainty invited invention, and that invention was compelling enough to shake the crown. There are even more outlandish theories. Some claim the princes lived in exile under new names, or that Richard grew up in the Low Countries, protected by distant cousins. A handful of anonymous graves scattered across Europe have even been speculated to hold their remains. Each theory leans on the same foundation. The story we've been told doesn't fully explain what happened. Mainstream historians often dismiss these ideas, and with good reason. No hard evidence has ever emerged to prove that either prince survived, but absence is not proof of death. And until science is allowed to speak through DNA, every theory, no matter how unlikely, remains technically possible. We may never know for sure whether Edward and Richard were murdered in the tower, or if history simply chose the most convenient version of the truth. But the persistence of these alternative stories reminds us of something essential. People wanted to believe the boys lived, that even in a brutal age, innocence might have found a way out, that the tower didn't win, and that somewhere, two boys who were born to rule might have had the chance, however briefly, to simply live. For centuries, Richard III stood in the shadows of English history, crooked in back, cruel in mind, and forever haunted by the alleged murder of his nephews. Shakespeare's venomous portrayal of him as a deformed tyrant with a spider's soul became the defining image, a hunchbacked villain who clawed his way to the throne through deceit and blood. But in the 21st century, a different Richard began to emerge, one not conjured from Tudor propaganda, but exhumed from the earth itself. In 2012, archaeologists from the University of Leicester, guided by historians and a remarkable combination of archival records and ground-penetrating radar, discovered a skeleton beneath a city car park. The site was once the Greyfriars Friary, the final resting place of Richard III after his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Few believed they'd find him. Even fewer imagined the discovery would trigger a reassessment of his entire legacy. The bones told a different story. They belonged to a man in his early 30s with battle injuries that matched historical accounts, one fatal blow to the skull, another to the pelvis, likely after death. The spine was curved, a clear case of scoliosis, not the grotesque hunchback described by Shakespeare, but enough to make one shoulder higher than the other. DNA testing, conducted by Dr. Turi King and her team, confirmed the identity, a direct match to descendants of Richard's sister. The king in the car park was real. The discovery reignited a long-simmering movement, the Richard III Rehabilitation Campaign. For decades, a growing group of historians, authors, and enthusiasts, many associated with the Richard III Society, had argued that the traditional image of Richard was built on lies. According to them, he was not a tyrant, but a capable administrator and loyal brother who inherited a broken kingdom. They pointed to his legal reforms, such as the introduction of bail to prevent indefinite imprisonment and his attempts to restrict corruption in land disputes. These weren't the acts of a despot, they were the acts of a reformer. The society's central argument, that Richard III was maligned by the Tudors, who had every incentive to portray him as a usurping murderer. After all, Henry VII's claim to the throne was weak, built more on conquest than blood. Demonizing Richard, and by extension, validating the prince's disappearance as his crime, was politically essential. Thomas More, Polydore Virgil, and Shakespeare all wrote under Tudor or Elizabethan reigns. Their pens were not impartial. But even as Richard's image is cleaned, the central question remains, did he kill the princes? The evidence is circumstantial. He had motive. The boys stood in the way of his crown. He had opportunity. They were in his custody. He had means, control of the tower and its guards. But what he lacked was a confession or a body. No contemporary chronicler definitively accused him. The earliest accounts come years later, often second-hand. Richard never publicly addressed the boys' fate. He neither confirmed their death nor blamed others. That silence is, perhaps, his most damning legacy. If he were innocent, why not speak? If someone else acted, why not condemn them? For his supporters, his restraint was caution, or grief, or political calculus. For his critics, it was guilt. Modern historians remain divided. Some, like Philippa Langley, who led the excavation in Leicester, argue that Richard was a victim of history's winners. Others, like Dr. David Starkey, maintain that while he may not have ordered the murders, he benefited from them and did nothing to stop them. It's a debate not just about a man, but about the stories we accept, the truths we ignore, and the power of legacy. Richard's reburial in 2015 at Leicester Cathedral was a solemn national event. His coffin was draped in the royal standard, crowds gathered, bells tolled. For a king once buried in shame, it was a moment of redemption, but not of exoneration. The story of Richard III is no longer black and white. It is a study in grey, in lost records, political necessity, and the struggle to tell the truth when the evidence is centuries old and the consequences still echo. Was he England's most slandered monarch, or did he simply wear a crown that demanded the silencing of two small voices? The bones beneath Leicester tell us who Richard was in life and death, but until the bones beneath Westminster are tested, we may never know who he truly was in history. The bones may lie silent, but the world has never stopped talking. From the Elizabethan stage to 21st century Reddit threads, the mystery of the princes in the tower has haunted the public imagination like no other cold case in British history. In the absence of certainty, the court of public opinion has stepped in, rendering verdicts in novels, plays, forums, surveys, and docuseries. The result? A tapestry of fascination and division, woven from speculation, drama, and centuries of retelling. It began with Shakespeare, whose Richard III, written over 100 years after the princes vanished, cemented the popular image of the villainous king. In his hands, Richard became a monster, twisted in spine and spirit, scheming his way through seduction and murder, finally extinguishing his nephews like candles snuffed out in the dark. Audiences gasped, wept and cheered as justice caught up with the tyrant, but few paused to ask, was it true? For generations, Shakespeare's version became the public truth. Schoolchildren recited his soliloquies. Painters captured Richard's sneer. The tower became a Gothic symbol of innocence betrayed. And yet, even as that image settled into history, a counter-narrative began to form. In the 20th and 21st centuries, revisionist historians and historical fiction authors offered a different Richard. Josephine Tey's 1951 novel The Daughter of Time cast a modern detective in a hospital bed, piecing together the puzzle of Richard's reputation and concluding he was innocent. The book became a cult classic, cited as one of the most influential detective stories of all time, not for its crime-solving, but for how it challenged accepted history. More recently, Philippa Gregory, author of The White Queen and other Tudor-era novels, reignited interest in the period with her portrayal of Elizabeth Woodville and her children, not just as political pawns, but as human beings caught in the machinery of dynastic ambition. Gregory's novels and their adaptations on television helped bring new generations into the debate, blending emotional truth with historical uncertainty. The rise of the internet pushed the conversation into new territory. On platforms like Reddit, YouTube, and TikTok, amateur historians, true crime enthusiasts, and curious readers debate theories with the same intensity once reserved for courtroom dramas. The subreddit r/unresolved mysteries hosts thousands of posts about the Tower case, weighing everything from the physical evidence to the psychology of each suspect. Conspiracy meets scholarship, passion meets precision. And then there are the polls, glimpses into how modern minds judge medieval mysteries. A 2014 BBC History magazine poll asked readers, "Who do you believe killed the princes in the Tower?" The result? Richard III still led the list, blamed by over 50% of respondents. But, strikingly, 23% said, "Don't know," and nearly 10% believed Henry VII was responsible. A growing number simply questioned whether the boys had died at all. This shift reflects more than just changing historical tastes. It shows the power of access. As information becomes more democratic, so too does historical judgment. Today, you don't need a university or a royal archive to study the past. You need a search engine and a sense of curiosity. Documentaries too have added layers of perspective. From Channel 4's Richard III, The King in the Car Park, to BBC's The Mystery of the Princes in the Tower, viewers have been presented with the case like jurors in a courtroom, given the facts, the suspects, and the silences. The verdict remains split. In the end, the people's verdict is not a single answer, but a spectrum of belief. Some cling to the traditional narrative that Richard III was a ruthless usurper. Others believe he was framed, the victim of a Tudor smear campaign. Still others hope, however faintly, that the princes survived or that the bones are not theirs, and that a final twist awaits in the next chapter of this still unfolding mystery. What unites all of them is fascination, because this isn't just a royal cold case, it's a mirror, a reflection of how we interpret power, guilt, innocence, and the human need for closure. The Tower doesn't just hold the past, it holds the stories we tell about the past and the ways in which we choose to believe them. So, we continue to ask, what really happened in 1483? And more importantly, why does it still matter? Centuries have passed since the laughter of two royal brothers echoed through the Tower of London. Their lives, once marked for kingship, ended not with ceremony but with disappearance. Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were not felled on a battlefield, nor laid to rest with royal honours. They simply vanished, swallowed by power, politics, and time. In the chapters before this one, we have laid out the case like investigators revisiting an ancient crime scene. We examined the turbulent world they were born into, a nation fractured by war and ambition. We watched their rise, brief and bright, into royal status before being shut behind the stone walls of the Tower. We tracked the ruthless climb of Richard III and explored the chilling silence that followed his coronation. We listened to whispers from foreign diplomats, propaganda penned by Tudor hands, and modern historians who saw redemption in bones and shadows. We unearthed the 1674 discovery of two child skeletons beneath a tower staircase, bones quickly attributed to the princes and interred in Westminster Abbey without definitive proof. We followed the first cautious attempt at science in 1933, an examination limited by technology and shaped by caution. And then we stepped into the present, where DNA analysis, isotope profiling, and radiocarbon dating could answer in weeks what history has asked for centuries. We've profiled the suspects, Richard III, with motive and opportunity but no confession, Buckingham, the wild card with ambition, Henry VII, the silent victor who never sought justice, Margaret Beaufort, the mother of a dynasty, whose influence may have extended further than we'll ever know, and we explored the alternatives, that the boys escaped, were substituted, or lived on under false names like Perkin Warbeck, a man who nearly fractured the Tudor throne with his claim to be the younger prince. We have studied the people's verdict, how generations from Shakespearean audiences to Reddit theorists have wrestled with this mystery, We have watched history twist, rewrite, and defend itself through drama, fiction, and political necessity. And yet, for all the storytelling, the one voice we haven't heard clearly is the truth. That truth may still lie in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, untested, untouched, and tightly sealed. We have the tools. DNA can now be extracted from even the smallest fragments. Comparative samples from known royal descendants exist. Isotope analysis could reveal whether these children lived on noble diets, in specific regions, and at the time believed. Radiocarbon dating can narrow the date of death. Together, these tools can speak for the voiceless. They can give names to bones. They can tell us whether these were the princes or someone else entirely. So why haven't we done it? The refusal is rooted in tradition, reverence, and fear. The Church of England, which oversees the remains, has declined requests to test them. Some fear disturbing royal burial sites opens a dangerous precedent. Others fear the consequences of what we might find, a vindication of Richard III, or a darker stain on the Tudor legacy. But history isn't meant to be preserved in amber. It's meant to be examined, questioned, challenged. The sanctity of the past does not come from silence, but from truth. This is not about crowns, politics, or royal reputation. It is about two children, trapped in a storm of ambition they never chose. Two brothers whose final days were stolen, whose identities remain uncertain, and whose story, even after 500 years, has not been properly told. To deny them testing is to deny them justice, and for a society that claims to value truth, evidence, and dignity, that is no longer acceptable. This case, one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in Western history, remains open. The suspects may be long dead, the crime scene altered, but the victims still wait, beneath stone, beneath silence. History doesn't belong behind sealed vaults. If the truth exists, we must pursue it. Not for kings, not for crowns, but for two boys who vanished in the dark,